Be honest, when was the last time you thought about your current business insurance policy? If your existing business insurance policy is renewing on autopilot each year without checking out Zensurance, you're probably spending more than you need. That's why you need to switch to low-cost coverage from Zensurance before your policy renews this year. Zensurance does all the heavy lifting to find a policy, covering only what you need, and policies start at only $19 per month. So if your policy is renewing soon, go to Zensurance.com and buy your policy online in just a few minutes. Zensurance, mind your business.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
This week, a week after the U.S. election in which America elected a decidedly climate-unfriendly president, experts and world leaders will meet at the United Nations Annual Climate Conference, where they'll discuss how on earth they plan to hit climate targets that look more unreachable by the day.
Delegates arrive in Baku to a major reality check. The venue for this year's climate talks is sandwiched between two oil fields. The so-called nodding donkeys pumping Azerbaijan's oil wealth quietly remind negotiators fossil fuels flow faster than ever. Less quietly, America's next president is doing the same.
Leave the oil to me. We have more liquid gold, oil and gas. We have more liquid gold than any country in the world, more than Saudi Arabia.
Now, I would understand if here is where you begin to feel depressed and you want to turn this podcast off, go back to bed. But you shouldn't. Not yet. Because as you'll hear today, progress on this issue is inevitable. Regardless of Trump, regardless of anything else, it will happen. There are a couple of questions around it. One is, sadly, just how bad things will get as that happens. But the other question is a lot more hopeful. If we handle this right, is there a way to make the action that we'll inevitably take on climate impact so many other aspects of our lives that need the same sort of urgency? And the answer to that one is probably yes. There is a world in which the way out of the climate crisis is also the way out of a ton of other problems. And it might very well end up being in everyone's best interests, even in Trump's, even in the oil and gas companies, to tackle the problem that way. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Dr. Elizabeth Sawin is the director of the Multisolving Institute, an organization that advocates, as you'll learn today, for addressing climate change, equity, health, well-being, and biodiversity as an interconnected solution. She's also the author of a new book, which is out this month, called Multisolving: Creating Systems Change in a Fractured World. Hello, Beth.
Hello.
Thanks so much for finding a little time for us.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, we wanted to get someone on here who could give us a bird's eye view, or an even further up eye view, I guess, on the big picture of climate change as we kind of move towards the end of the year. And I wanted to do that because I feel like a lot of people's experience with the climate crisis this year has been, awfully anecdotal in a series of extreme weather events around the world. And when you kind of see the conversation become about that, what does that say in terms of how we see climate change if it's changing?
Well, I think what people are sensing, Jordan, and what you're pointing to is exactly what climate scientists have been predicting for a long time, which is the deeper we get into this crisis, the more frequent and more extreme these events are going to be. I know I live in Vermont in the Northeast United States, and in one summer, we had two what were called 1 in 1,000-year rain events, right? So
yes.
If we were in the old climate, on average, that would happen once every 1,000 years, and it was happening with 2 weeks separation. And the previous summer had the same kind of thing. And we're not alone here in Vermont. You're exactly right that it's happening all around the world. And I know in Canada, wildfires is maybe one of the largest ones, but not the only sort of climate shock being experienced.
And what I find I was going to say interesting, but it's actually rather kind of depressing about it, is obviously there are these big events that get a lot of coverage. The massive flooding in Spain, the hurricanes in the southern United States, and as you mentioned, the wildfires up here during the summer. But then there are also the small but important changes I think regular people are starting to notice. It was 22 degrees here a few days ago and the second or third day of November in Toronto, in Canada. And that's the kind of thing where nothing is really bad about this, but it feels wrong. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I actually learned a word for that feeling recently. I heard someone call it a delightmare.
Ooh.
We're actually wow, this is a really nice day. And then another part of us is this is very wrong.
Yeah.
And we know what it portends. So it's very confusing, I find.
What do we know, if we could zoom out a bit from the anecdotes and how people experience it, about the big picture of the climate crisis? What are the latest numbers telling us about this year?
Yeah, well, for this, I looked to the UN Environment Program. Every year they put out a report, and it just happened a couple weeks ago, called the Emissions Gap Report. And they're mirroring back to all of us how the world's countries are doing at meeting their climate goals. So a few numbers. The goal is to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And the UNEP Emissions Gap Report says that actually the current pledges, if you take what all the countries in the world have said they're going to do to limit emissions, it puts us more on track for 2.6 to 2.8 degrees C by the end of this century. So 1.5 versus, say, 2.7. And even more worrying than that, that's if countries do what they have promised. But many countries are not on track. Their policies aren't going to deliver what they've promised without upgrades. And so that anticipated amount of temperature increase is something like 3.1 degrees.
Wow.
So we step back, we're talking about the floods, the fires, the strange weather, and that's at somewhere like 1.3 to 1.4 degrees of warming. So I think people are starting to be able to extrapolate, if we're having trouble coping now, what is this end of the century destination? What does that look like? And it's very, very worrisome.
We've done episodes before about the climate crisis where scientists and other experts have talked about, a tipping point in this crisis where you get this kind of feedback loop of warming that encourages more warming, that encourages extreme events, which then do the same thing. Are we reaching that? And how would we know if we were?
Yeah, well, the thing about tipping points and our imperfect understanding of the climate is that we know they're out there. We have a rough sense of how deep into warming before various ones tip, but we don't know exactly when. And the thing about tipping points, as you say, they're irreversible, right? So we put more and more greenhouse gas into the climate. It's the human disturbance. But when what we've done starts the Earth system doing its own warming, we can't stop that. We can't reverse it. And so I'm not sure that have we crossed those points yet, or where are they, is the most important question for people. I think it's, what do you think our stance should be when we know that these tipping points are out there? And for me, the principle that I think of is called the precautionary principle. If there's a devastating risk and you're powerless to stop it once it starts, then the most important thing is back away from the edge, which is why this work of getting off of fossil fuels and shifting to a clean energy economy is so important.
Why do you think more nations or people in power can't see the precautionary principle, or if they can, can't bring themselves to act on it? And this is something, look, even 5 years ago, I probably would have understood it with all the economic concerns out there, but it's rapidly kind of becoming untenable to look at it that way, right?
Yeah, well, I think you're leaving maybe one piece out of the puzzle, and we often do. That's the point, that there are just incredibly powerful industries with a vested interest in continuing to extract and burn fossil fuels.
Right.
And those industries, they're not just passive partners in this drama, and it's been documented in books like Merchants of Doubt, intentional strategies to delay action and distort information. We just finished out, obviously, a consequential election in the U.S. And in the news very much has been people's civil rights and where is it easy to vote and where is it difficult. We have a problem with gerrymandering. And that matters for climate because other studies show that the people with the most incentive to act on climate are often in the U.S. people of color, people from immigrant communities who are generally strongly aligned with climate action. So if we have our political processes being distorted by industries that are trying to slow action, that distorts this whole picture. And so lots of times people get frustrated with people or with government. But I think we really need to look at the factor of vested interest slowing action too.
These events, as they continue to worsen and occur with more regularity, are, at least to most predictions, going to make some places on Earth that are currently inhabited pretty much uninhabitable. When we see that actually happen and we start to see like massive climate migration, say out of places like Arizona where it tops 110 degrees every day, or places like the prairies up here in Canada where you're spending 6 months of your year potentially breathing in smoke, why doesn't that shift the equation, or will it?
I think that one of the challenges of responding to climate change is it's happening on many levels at the same time. So there's individuals making decisions to relocate or not. And then there's collective action to get at the root of the problem. And we haven't always connected the feedback loops between those two things. It's why it's really important in people's conversations with each other to draw attention back to the cause. So not only like this more difficult weather or why are we choosing to move, not only linking it to climate change, but linking climate change to the root cause drivers of fossil fuels. Like I think that's how a society as a whole gets its attention turned back to the root cause. I think it's also important when we start to talk about people relocating to add in the layer of justice and equity. I hear more and more the term climate gentrification and the fact that people with wealth and means are able to move to safety. And some of these places that are becoming harder and harder to live in are going to become the territories of those who can't escape. We see that happening around the world, whether it's, low-lying places or places that are safer from wildfires. So we need to be intentional about, as best we can, managing these forces and these movements to make sure that we take care of everyone.
Because I don't want to be a doomsayer this entire conversation, I also really want to ask you about the progress that we have made on cutting emissions and replacing fossil fuels with renewables. How has that been trending at the same time as, we have obviously not been hitting all our commitments?
Great question. It's important to name all the forces that are moving in the direction we need to move. We're seeing really dramatic decreases in the costs of things like renewable energy, whether it's solar panels or batteries. And that is itself part of a feedback loop. And it also has tipping points, since we're talking about feedback and tipping points. With every doubling of installed capacity of renewable energy, economies of scale kick in, prices fall, making it accessible to more people, which leads to more installed capacity. And you can see where that leads. So that's one of the more encouraging things. And our real opportunity is to align with those trends and make sure that our incentives and our decision-making and our values are all pushing in the same direction.
How do we move from talking to each other about, we know this is a problem. Boy, this weather is weird. Oh my gosh, my basement flooded 3 times this year. This is the reality of the climate crisis, to individual action, but also collective action at a time when it can feel as though, I'm talking about the US election now, but I mean, we might have a similar result in Canada soon, that our political leaders are actually moving away from taking this action.
Well, one of the most promising things for me, and this is the subject of my book that comes out later this month, is the idea of multisolving. Multisolving is a frame of reference, and it's noticing the fact that when we shift away from fossil fuels, other things change too. So fossil fuels aren't only the source of greenhouse gases, they also are the source of particulates and air pollution. And those substances contribute to all kinds of health issues like asthma and respiratory disease and premature birth, cardiovascular disease. So it's a huge win for our health system as we shift from fossil fuels. In fact, the World Health Organization says the costs of the transition off of fossil fuels are more than offset by the health system benefits. And so the opportunity there, as we're talking about shifting vested interests and trying to open up the potential for change, are these partnerships where the goals, say, in the health sector and the goals of the climate transition are lined up. And then we have larger budgets, bigger swaths of voters, more people to show up and take political action. And health is just one of the intersections, right? We can make our cities more resilient at the same time that we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We can do that by planting a lot more trees, which are going to help soak up stormwater. They're going to reduce our energy bills for air conditioning by providing shade. And they're going to make cities safer during heat waves. I can get excited about all these examples. And that's part of why I wrote the book, was just to share with people we could make the world so much better in the process of addressing this crisis.
Explain a little more to me about that then, in terms of how we get that going at a systemic level when, and I can't speak for everywhere around the world, but in Canada, we've had 3 levels of government. It's often tough to get the provincial government and the federal government to agree on anything. And it can often feel, I think, to citizens, especially ones who are really concerned about this crisis, that like, shouldn't be up to me, like planting trees in my neighborhood, you know? Like, how do we move this forward on a systemic level?
Yeah, well, a fascinating thing about multisolving is that we see it happening at every level, from the neighborhood to the nation. And sometimes we remind people that the biggest power you have is the power where you can act. You know, I might have a much bigger influence if I was head of the International Monetary Fund. I'm not, but where I do have influence, you know, might be my local government. So that's one thing, is that the sum of lots of action at the local level does add up to a lot. The second thing is that there are these partnerships that can happen that span levels, and they look different in different places. But there are partnerships that we've studied where some of the partners come from the mayor's office, but some are from state government and some are local community groups. And Multisolving, one thing that attracts me to it is how improvisational it is.
Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, well, it's very fit to the local conditions, like fit to what's needed. One example we looked at was in New Zealand, and it was a response in 2008 to the financial crisis and a worry about jobs in the construction sector. So it's fit to circumstance in that it was a presenting issue. What they did was get the building trades back to work by doing home energy upgrades, and that saved energy. So it reduced the energy bills for the people who lived in those homes, and it reduced greenhouse gas emissions while getting the construction sector working. But then the really interesting thing was they looked at the health of people living in those buildings, and they saw reduced visits to the emergency department and lower costs for medications because they were living in healthier housing. And in the second round of that program, public health agencies joined into the home weatherization effort, and doctors were able to refer patients for home energy upgrades. So that's what I mean by this sort of like shape shifting to fit opportunities and needs and local conditions.
When you want people to move towards solutions from the conversation, especially in the aftermath of something that's been so devastating or upsetting to their livelihoods or their lives, how do you do that in a way that moves it towards positive action? And I ask this in the same sense, I guess, that we often hear in the wake of mass shootings in America, you know, that this isn't the time to talk about the systemic problem of guns. This is a time to rebuild, to mourn, to help the victims, to do whatever. And I sort of see that when we start talking about, you know, the way these hurricanes have ravaged Florida, or the way that towns in Alberta or Saskatchewan have been threatened by fire.
Yeah. Well, I think it's not only one thing, and there's trauma responses happening,
Right.
but there also is, and we see this in the examples that we look at, a very natural form of multi-solving that happens early on in recovery. And many stories of like this are coming out of Western North Carolina right now, of local businesses and community-based organizations weaving together to get help to those who need it, to get the recovery started, to bring in batteries and solar power so that people have access to energy to charge their phones.
Right.
So it's actually a natural human tendency to forge these relationships in times of need. And what we're really advocating is amplify that. That's part of the best of us. And it really can be something we draw on in this moment.
When you talk about multi-solving in a response to the crisis, I wonder how that fits into another challenge that I think we can face when addressing this crisis, which is like the need for humans to see some tangible results, right? So like if we want to talk about keeping emissions under a target that would lead us to 1.5 instead of 3 degrees, like it's going to take years to turn this ship around. And it is sometimes difficult to get people, but especially politicians, to focus on using resources in an effort that they likely won't get the credit for in their time in office. How does a multi-solving approach to that offer evidence that this is working rather than just like hoping for the best in the long run?
Yeah, this is actually one of the most important reasons to employ multi-solving, because what we do when we're multi-solving is we bundle together different benefits that play out at a different pace. So exactly as you're saying, the climate benefits might be decades off, long after, say, a politician's term of office has ended. But if you're getting fossil fuels out of the economy, other benefits are happening a lot more quickly. The air is getting cleaner. People are getting healthier. If you did that by installing walking and cycling, people are, again, getting healthier. There's added layers of mobility for a city. There's proven economic benefits when people move through a neighborhood on foot or on a bike. They stop at cafes. They spend a little money in local businesses. It's quite substantial. So those are all things that are very important to political leaders and things they can point to say, while we're doing this important long-term work, we also are taking care of one another right now.
The last thing I want to ask you on this note is, when you look at a multi-solving approach to the climate crisis, what is the one thing that people maybe don't understand about the situation that we're in or what comes next that you feel that we could if we look to tackle it through that method?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is really to expand our imaginations and to see that there's an awful lot that really could get better by virtue of how we act to address the climate crisis, and to expand the boundaries of what we look at to include social justice, to include climate change, to include healthier food and cleaner water and better jobs. There are ways to address climate change that won't produce quite so many benefits, but we really, in my view, should prioritize the ones that give us so much of what we want and need as well.
Beth, Dr. Sawin, thank you so much for this. It's really a really fascinating way to look at a huge problem.
Yeah, thank you, Jordan. I enjoyed the conversation a lot.
Dr. Elizabeth Sawin, the director of the Multisolving Institute. You can read her book, Multisolving: Creating Systems Change in a Fractured World. That was The Big Story. For more from us, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca, where we try to cover the climate crisis with a little bit of hope. You can shoot us feedback on this episode or any other by emailing hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling us at 416-935-5935 and leaving us a voicemail. The Big Story is available wherever you get your podcasts. It's also on your smart speaker if you ask it to play The Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.